Well, hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Recall Readiness, How to Conduct a Mock Recall and Ensure Traceability. So this event is brought to you by Food Safety Magazine. I'm Adrienne Bloom, Editorial Director of Food Safety Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, and we want to thank you for joining us. So today's presenters are Bob Manning, Founder and Principal Consultant at Manning Resource LLC, and also Sean Stevens, food industry lawyer and founder at Food Industry Council, LLC. Now, as a note, FDA Recalls Branch Acting Director Arma White was originally supposed to join us for this webinar, but due to the communications freeze imposed on FDA by the new administration, Arma was unfortunately unable to join us today. So I will rejoin our two presenters at the end of the webinar to help answer your questions that come in throughout the webinar. So don't forget to submit those in that Q&A and chat section of the webinar console. Today's event is also being recorded and will be archived on food-safety.com.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Manning, and I'm the founder of Manning Resource. And today, as mentioned, we're going to be talking about mock recalls. And to start, what I'd like to do is talk about a book that I had released in 2023 called In the Midst of a Recall. Now, a lot of these slides will be pulled from this book and as well as other experiences that I've had throughout my career. But it's important to understand that a mock recall is really an entire system that you're testing. It's not just a traceability exercise. And while I think many companies do these traceability exercises within the facilities, what I'd like to emphasize is really stressing the entire system or testing the entire system, because when a real recall hits, this is when you have a multitude of different people working together. So again, just emphasizing that it's beyond a simulation of a traceability exercise. It is a true mock recall. So when we look at being ready for a recall or conducting these mock recalls, there's some essential components to look at to really ensure your success. And first and foremost, the ability to trace your product through the system, whether it's an ingredient or if it's a production run that you need to identify and trace. That's the critical component, to identify exactly what components you're going after, and then from there to be able to track it through the system. Next, you want to make sure that you are stressing your system and looking for the vulnerabilities within your system to see where can you improve the process. Again, when you conduct these mock recalls, you're continuing to do this month after month to be able to improve the foundation of your system. So in the event a real recall happens, you can accurately and quickly identify those items. Obviously, the key benefits are to improve your system. And again, through a repeat of these systems or a repeat of these mock recalls will help you build the systems and improve your processes to be able to gather this information quickly. And so the question is why? Well, when we look at some of the statistics out there and some of the challenges that these companies face, what we're seeing right now is, depending on whose information you look at, recalls run between $10 and $15 million. However, this past year, we've seen some really devastating recalls, which are going to be in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And so it's critical for you to be able to go through your systems, make sure that you're continuing to test them, and to be ready and hopefully never have to enact a full or a real recall, but to be able and be prepared to do that. Now, I mentioned accuracy and speed. And one of the things that I would emphasize is for you to really focus on the accuracy. What we've seen in 2024 and even in 2023 and before, we're seeing where recalls are conducted. However, there are follow-up expansions of those recalls. And so you can imagine, as a brand owner or a company, if you have to go out and conduct a recall, that's devastating to begin with. But if you have to expand that recall in the future, obviously now you have a product that has been out in the marketplace that consumers could consume, and you have to go back out and put your name out there again and expand that recall. So these are catastrophic events for companies. So I definitely encourage you to focus on the accuracy and the speed at which you conduct these mock recalls. So there's some things that you can do to be prepared. And if you follow these steps, it will ensure your preparedness for these types of events. And again, hopefully you never have to use them. So first is really making sure that your organization understands and is fully supportive of your mock recalls, as well as making sure that you're aligned with both your regulatory bodies as well as any GFSI bodies that you're working with. Whether it's the FDA or the USDA or the CFIA, you want to make sure that you are fully compliant with their regulations. Next, you want to make sure that you have a solid, robust system. And here you have your plan in place and you have your SOPs and your checklists in place so you can refer back to them in the event that you have this recall. One of the things that I've seen be very effective is the assembly of teams. Now, again, most companies will conduct the mock recalls at the facilities. And again, a lot of times they are traceability exercises. And what I would encourage you to do is to test both systems, test your facilities as well as the corporate side. Because in the event of a real recall, these teams are going to be pulled into this recall and they're going to have to work together. So I would encourage you to have two different teams. You have your corporate team, and again, both of them will be cross-functional. So you have your corporate team, which consists of maybe your legal teams or your public relation teams, operations, quality, etc., sales and marketing. And in the facilities, you want to look at your quality, your maintenance, operations, sanitation, etc. But if you have two teams working together, it will actually make the process go a lot smoother. Through this process, you want to make sure that you have very clear roles and responsibilities, and you want to make sure that the teams stay within their levels of responsibilities and that they're not going outside of that. And to assure this, you want to make sure that you're doing some training to get everybody up on the same page. For each recall, you want to make sure that you establish your goals and objectives. And in this case, you may say, well, we want to focus on this ingredient and we want to make sure that we can trace it within 2 hours. And then we're going to hand that off to the corporate team and they're going to do their components. And then we'll get back together and we'll talk about it. But if you have very good, solid goals and objectives, it just improves the process at which your teams will work. Next, I would say for companies that are conducting mock recalls on a regular basis, obviously you're not doing smaller type ingredients. However, if you're a company that's just getting going with regard to mock recalls, I would say start with something small. Start with it like a single ingredient, start with a very small production run, identify your gaps and your challenges and build from there. I would definitely not go after a bulk ingredient or a long production run. Start with something small, build those wins under your team, and continue to build up that foundation. One thing that has been very effective for me with regard to recall or mock recalls is to have scenarios that you're before you go into these mock recalls. So for instance, you can create them in advance. You can actually have your mock recall teams create these, have them sit down and create different scenarios, some that are very easy, but others that are a little bit more complex. So when you go into these recalls, you literally have a small library of mock recalls that you can choose from. You pull it out and then you just work the system. So for instance, you might have an ingredient that you're looking at, lot number, whatever, of XYZ ingredient, or you have a small production run. This would obviously be on the smaller scale or the easier of your mock recalls. But if you are choosing something a little bit more difficult, this is when you can look at ingredients across multiple facilities or the intershipment of ingredients and things of that nature. One thing that I've found critically important is to make it real. And what I mean by that is, again, earlier in my career, I had conducted many traceability exercises. And here, what we want to do is we want to build in levels of realism. And so to do that, it would be great if mock recalls or real recalls happened at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, but that's not reality. It's going to happen. If it is going to happen, it will happen at any time of the day, and it may happen on the weekends. So you want to be prepared for that. Next, you want to make sure that you're simulating real life stresses. So for instance, if you have a recall team of 6 people, the day of the mock recall, you may want to pull out 2 people because now something else has happened, or they're on vacation, or there's a life event at their home and they need to attend to that. So start doing some things that really stress your system. You also want to be prepared for unexpected scenarios. And what I mean by that is, as you go through these mock recalls, as you look at the paperwork and as you bring it to the plant floor and you're digging through some of that paperwork, in the mock recall, remove some of that paperwork. Make it so it's realistic. I've gone through real recalls, and as you start digging through some of the information, you find out that it may be missing or it may be incorrect. So again, put in some situations to make it a little bit more real. You also want to look at some real world examples. So here, unfortunately, there's many out there to select from. So you can go to the FDA website or the USDA website, and you can look at previous recalls that had transpired, and you can gather important information, look at it within your system, test them against your system. One area that you could also look at is testing your hold and release procedures. So unfortunately, I've been involved in situations where product is produced, it's held, but then it's accidentally shipped. So look at some of these scenarios and again, test them within your systems. This is an area that I'm sure people are cringing with the thought of having an unannounced mock recall. However, as you start working through this, a lot of them will be announced, but to add another level of realism in, you may want to add unannounced mock recalls. Again, this is going to be real life, and it's going to be something where there's many constraints that prevent you from pulling your whole team together. So again, I would encourage you to mix it up a little bit. I'd like to say have fun with these, but they are very stressful. Certainly real recalls are very stressful. So you want to put different dynamics in to make them as realistic as possible. I put this slide in because although during a mock recall, you're probably not going to have somebody on the phone that looks like this or sounds like this, but I will tell you in a real recall, this does happen. And in a real recall, you may have many people calling you with a lot of passion, a lot of excitement. But what you want to do is have a system in place so as you're being bombarded with this information, there's something for you to rely on. And that comes down to discipline and having a disciplined approach. And what I mean by that is, first and foremost, you want to follow your plan, your SOPs, and your checklists. So I would definitely encourage you that as this mock recall kicks off, or unfortunately, if a real recall kicks off, you want to go right to your plan. You want to have a checklist that you follow, and you follow that checklist, and you follow the SOPs. And if you do that, that will keep you on track, and it will keep you from missing any information that could be needed later or is something that you'll need immediately. So have a disciplined approach and follow your mock recall or recall plan. Next, you want to make sure that you have your contacts outlined of who will be contacted and when they'll be contacted. Again, you're going to have a lot of people calling in. You're going to have a lot of people looking for information. And what you want to do is you want to follow a process in by priority, right? So your immediate boss, your legal counsel, whoever is calling, but make sure that people really identify who needs to reach into these teams and extract information. One of the things that I will call out is that I've been involved in a number of these, and unfortunately through this process in the real recalls, there were a number of people reaching into the organization to get information, and it didn't flow from one central source. So unfortunately, what was happening was information was leaking out from the organization. And the reason that I say it's unfortunate is because some of that information was incorrect. And it's not a matter of withholding information. It's just a matter of making sure that any information that leaves your facility is accurate. So you want to make sure that you really button down this process and that communications only come from those who have been identified to make those calls and to make those contacts. Of course, we want to make sure that you can trace the products through your system. But as you work through a mock recall or unfortunately a real recall, you want to be able to remove those products. So I would have you look at who's going to remove these products. So you have all this product on the shelves, who's going to remove them from the shelves? But more importantly, once they get removed, where are the products going to go? You don't want to have them shipped back to your facility. You want to make sure that they're going to a centralized location or different locations, especially if you've produced product all over the country or all over the world. You want to make sure that you have logistics in place to pull that back. So it's something to think about. Again, hopefully you never need to utilize it, but if you do have a recall, this product will be coming back. You also want to make sure that you're monitoring the performance, definitely through the mock recall. And one of the things with regard to the teams that you're working through is, we talked earlier about having a corporate team and a facility team. I would definitely encourage you having somebody there that their sole purpose is to record the information, both through a mock recall or through a real recall. And the reason for this is because as you're going through the process, things will happen that you completely dismiss or you forget. But if you have somebody taking detailed notes, it allows you to take that information and to build upon it in the future. So this person can not only doesn't only take notes, but then they go through and they measure the performance of the mock recall or the real recall. And from there, you take these findings and you use those to improve your process. Now, one thing that I would caution you on is, as you work through these mock recalls, please make sure that you inform your teams that these are mock recalls. And it may sound a little bit silly why I'm bringing this up, but unfortunately, I've been in times where we were conducting mock recalls, information got out to some of the teams, and then I had, unfortunately, somebody on the phone that looked like this person or sounded like this person calling me, asking me how we were having a recall. It wasn't a real recall, it was a mock recall. So just make sure that your teams are understanding that you may be having these mock recalls or when you're having them, just so people are fully aware. There's a lot of things to look at, and I talk about having a recall plan and SOPs, but one thing I would definitely encourage is a mock recall checklist. And so this, again, in the height of all of this chaos, in the height of all of this passion and excitement, you want to make sure that you're following a process. So what I would definitely encourage you to do is sit down with your teams. If you have a recall plan or if you have your SOPs in place, you want to build a checklist. If you don't have a checklist or an assessment form, you can reach out to me at bob@manningresource.com. I'm happy to provide you with these simple checklists. From there, you can take them, you can alter them, you can change them, you can make them work for you. But again, I would highly encourage you to have a simple checklist that you refer to that you can just follow in the event that you have a real recall, but more importantly, you're following it through a mock recall. So one thing that is what I found to be critically important is to debrief the team following your mock recall. And so here, I found the after action report or the after action review to be very beneficial. And what this is it's actually a document that's obtained from use in the military, and they're used after missions to evaluate those missions. And so you're really looking at what went well, what didn't go well, and how you're going to improve that process. And what I would highly encourage you to do is to look at an assessment form. So whatever type of regulatory body you're working with, whether it's the FDA or USDA, they may have an effectiveness formula that they follow. Here is one that I pulled right from the USDA that you can just take that formula and you can follow or you can assess your performance against that document. Some of the areas to really focus on is, did the team follow the plan? Was the communication protocols followed and were they effective? And could you trace the products through the system? I mean, those are some really key ingredients to follow. And if for some reason you have some missteps there, I would redo the process. Obviously, pick a different ingredient, pick a different production run, and do it again. Now, I know that many regulatory bodies or programs talk about doing mock recalls annually. I definitely would encourage you to do them quarterly. If you're just starting out, I would start monthly. And again, continue to build that process so they become very effective. Of course, you want to identify all the areas of improvement. And maybe it's a technological gap, or it is a gap within your training, or maybe it's within the process. You want to identify what those areas are, and you want to incorporate them in a plan that allows you to build upon the process. And so this action plan, I would keep it as a running total for every single mock recall that you do, because what you might see is you may see repeats happening. And from there, you can just make those a higher priority focus to improve your process. Of course, you want to gather your team feedback. So each team member is going to run into different challenges and opportunities as they go through their process. You want to sit down with the teams, collect all that information. And again, you want to make the most effective process that you can. And your goal is to never have to institute this process, but you want to make sure it's as solid as it can be. From there, you want to set your goals for the next mock recall. One of the things to add realism to your program is to include your executive leadership teams. And now many people may be doing that, but others may not. And the reason that I talk about this is because in the event of a real recall, your executive teams will be pulled into it. It may be even the CEO, all of their direct reports may be pulled into this mock recall, or into the real recall. Definitely your legal teams, your sales and marketing, all of those individuals are going to be pulled in. So by pulling them into the mock recalls, they can help with a number of different areas. So they can obviously make sure that the teams are focused on readiness, but it gives them an opportunity to hear what's going on, to identify what some of the challenges are, and to be able to be part of the program, as well as to allocate funds and resources if you're having challenges. So maybe you're having some people challenges, or you don't have enough people, or you have some technological gaps. They can step in and they can provide these funds and resources to help improve the process. Obviously, it will help with the recall preparedness, but it also drives a level of accountability, and it allows them to gather information that they can share with the rest of the executive teams and communicate some of the challenges and the struggles that you may be facing. By getting them involved, it helps them in their decision making as well. So you can imagine that if you're conducting these mock recalls at the facilities and the corporate teams aren't involved, and a real recall does hit, you would end up facing some of the same challenges that I had faced, where the teams at the plants were identifying all the right areas and the things that they needed to do. When it was handed off to the corporate teams, there was a little bit of a chaos because they weren't used to conducting these mock recalls. And so for the executive leaders on this call today, I would definitely encourage you to pull the executive team together and start running through these rehearsals as far as mock recalls at the corporate level, and get involved with the facilities to really drive that level of effectiveness, both at the facilities and at the corporate side. And then we talk about that level, or the executive leadership adding a layer of stress and realism, which it will absolutely do, but it also adds a layer of support, because as the facilities are working through some of these challenges, the corporate teams and the executive leaders can step in and help provide some more guidance and support, because they have the availability to step back a little bit and really see what's going on, taking that big picture approach and help guide the teams accordingly and be that level of support that you absolutely will need. So when we talk about some key takeaways on mock recalls, first and foremost, I would encourage you to do them as much as you can. Like I said, at a minimum of quarterly. If you're just getting going, I would start with monthly. And again, continue to build upon your wins and identify your opportunities to improve the process. You want to make it as realistic as possible. And we talked about some of the things that you can do to add that level of realism in and challenge your system. You want to learn from real world cases. And again, you can pull information from a multitude of different resources and start building that into your programs. As you go through these processes, you want to continue to evaluate your systems, to improve upon them, and continue to use, whether it's an after action review or it's some other process, you want to conduct those debriefs so you're absolutely working the system to improve the process. And then lastly, you want to make sure that your company and your organization is committed to being prepared. Again, you hope to never use these, and you hope that these mock exercises are nothing more than mock exercises. But what we're seeing in the world today and some of the challenges that companies face is that recalls, they do happen, they can be catastrophic, but if you take the steps today, you can absolutely improve your organization and improve the process with your teams. So we talked about many things, and I'm happy to help beyond this. So if I can be of any help to you, please feel free to contact me at bob@manningresource.com. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sean to discuss the legal side of things. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Bob. That was a great presentation, some really fabulous advice on an issue that I think increasingly is impacting really everybody in the food industry, which is the numbers of recalls that we're seeing occurring each and every year. And I predict as we continue to move forward, as we've seen over the course of the last number of decades, we'll continue to see the trends moving forward of the numbers of recalls increasing, the reasons for recalls increasing, and unfortunately, for some of the reasons that we're going to talk about today, the scopes of recalls increasing as well. Now, a recall, on one hand, we might say that it's a sort of routine phenomenon, which is to say that on average, there's about 600 recalls that occur every year of food and beverage products. Now, those don't include pet food or animal feed or dietary supplements, but just food and beverage products generally. We see about 600 per year. So on the one hand, these are something, and especially from a retail standpoint, that occur every day, that they occur frequently. But on the other hand, and I think this is changing too with every passing year, they're becoming a heck of a lot more chaotic, I think, than they used to be, and even perhaps than they need to be. I kind of liken to, you mentioned recalls being fun, Bob, and then you corrected yourself because they're not, as we all know. But I agree. I mean, going through the recall process in many cases is like, combining a haunted house, right, where there's something horrifying and there's terror around every corner, a fun house, to borrow the term fun, but not because it's fun. It's just because in a fun house, nothing really appears as it seems, or even as it is, right? We're often faced with incomplete information, incorrect information, and having to make determinations, I guess, about whether to run as fast as we can or hide with imperfect inputs. And then I guess a high adrenaline theme park to cap off the three with some of the worst roller coasters you might ever imagine. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It'd be fabulous if the recall process was always straightforward, if it was very easy, and we could, in essence, check the box. And it's for that reason, because they're not. I echo Bob's comments that it's so important to go through the mock process to test your organization and test your teams and do all of the things that Bob talked about in advance of that bad day actually showing up. Now, what are some of the things I think as when we talk about the trends that we're seeing, especially in the last year with respect to recalls and what's happening and the consequences that are falling, right, as a result of recalls, it's changing drastically. What we're seeing today is much different than what we saw just a few years ago. But I think before we dive into sort of the trends of what we're seeing, it's important to talk a little bit about the causes of recalls. So we had put together some data that we drew from our recall reporter, foodrecallreporter.com, where we've tracked and we have details on every food and beverage recall for the last 25 years. I throw salmonella up there only because I think it's always good for us to have a friendly reminder that it's never fun to have salmonella at your dinner party. So we have a little bit of fun with salmonella I was actually approached by USDA asking if they might at some point use these two characters as part of their public education for consumers in safe handling. Because it is true, we never want salmonella at our dinner party, but unfortunately, sometimes they do show up. So if we look at the causes of recalls over the course, this is some data we extracted from our recall reporter for the last 10 years, 2004, dating back to 2014. And you see there, on average, for food and beverage recalls, there's about 603 recalls per year. Of those 603, I'll tell you, some companies, yes, will experience more than one recall per year. But on average, these are 603 different recalls from different companies involving different products. So, the message here is if we haven't had a recall in the last few years or ever, our number might be called. The recall lottery, right, might land on our number, and we'd be faced with the types of things that we're talking about today. Interestingly, if we look at the causes, at least the big three causes of recalls, the first is always undeclared allergens, representing about 41% of recalls every year. And what stunned me as I put together this data was year to year to year, the numbers are almost identical. 2014, 43%, then 46% the next year, 37% drops a little bit back to 47% in 2017. And if we just look across the line, right, on average, we're seeing about 40% of recalls being caused by undeclared allergens. We'll probably have a little bump now that sesame seeds, sesame has been added to the list. So we're going to see, we've seen, and we'll continue to see more recalls driven as a result of that. Pathogens, accounting for about 1 in every 4 recalls in the United States. 1 in every 4, about 25%. And again, if we look year to year to year, those averages it's frightening how consistent they really are. With Listeria kind of taking the lead with 13% on average of all recalls. Salmonella comes in second. Salmonella come in second, about 10%. Salmonella used to be more highly ranked, especially after PCA more than a decade and a half ago. But Listeria is really what's driving recalls today, and is also driving a lot of the new policies that we see being unleashed by the agencies. And then E. coli, all varieties, 015787 and non-0157 STEX are big drivers as well. And then foreign materials, on average, year to year, around 10% are driving our recalls. So, as an industry, I think we can continue to get better. But as our surveillance, our food safety controls, our ability to monitor and detect also become better, we're going to find more. The more we test, the more we look, the more we see, the more we find. And I think recalls on average will continue to increase, and it's only a matter of time until we are ultimately going to be involved. So there's really kind of 3 points or messages I'd like to share today. And the first is how the scope of recalls is changing. The second is the consequences ranging from FDA or USDA expecting companies to shutter their doors, at least for some period after announcing a recall for a significant issue, and then new litigation that's being filed against companies on the heels of making announcements of recalls. Scope is something that kind of jerked my head back a little bit. I kind of felt for a little while this year, maybe I even had some whiplash after watching some of the recalls that were being pushed by the agencies. What we've seen really beginning this year is a departure from the old days when the agencies would try to, rely and lean on the company to make that determination as to what was the root cause or the root source of that particular issue. But in doing so, in the old days, a company could say, listen, we did a root source analysis and we've determined that the cause was line 4 and it was a particular shift or lot of production. And that was sufficient. That would satisfy the regulators. Today, and really beginning this year, both FDA and USDA have taken a different approach, which is to say, well, boy, if you had listeria, yeah, sure, it may have been in product that was produced on a particular line, but if we kind of use our imagination and we stand back and we think about all the different ways that if listeria was on that line, maybe somebody sneezed and it could have aerosolized from that line and landed on somebody's shoulder, and then that person walking through the facility carried it to another line, and then maybe they bent over, or they just kind of rearranged their smock, and then it aerosolized again, and maybe it landed on a pallet jack and it was transferred over to yet another line. And the question comes from the agencies, well, can you, the food company, prove to us that somebody didn't sneeze? And the answer, in many cases, well, no, we can't. Well, then the second question is, well, then how can you prove to us that other products in that processing facility aren't affected? And in many cases, companies are not in a position to be able to do that. It's sort of like having somebody walk in your bedroom and say, well, can you prove to us there's not a boogie monster in the closet? And you say, well, sure, let me go to the closet and open it up, and there's no boogie monster in there. And then the regulators say, well, prove to us there's not an invisible boogie monster. And well, it's kind of hard to prove, as you can imagine. So, we're seeing the agencies take this sort of more broader, sort of creative approach to recall management, and really pushing and forcing companies to establish that all products in the processing environment, that all products produced over multiple days or weeks, all products produced on multiple lines are in fact suspect and shouldn't be included. And this is a huge change from what we used to observe, which was we could limit it to a particular shift on a particular day and a particular line. And the agencies I see increasingly just aren't buying those arguments and requiring companies to recall more product. If you're wondering what that looks like in writing, just look at FSIS's most recent notice in December, published, I think it was December 17th, where the agency articulates new questions that the regulators are supposed to ask food processor, USDA regulated establishments regarding that produce ready-to-eat foods, regarding listeria control and what they're doing in their facilities and what they're seeing. And it actually instructs USDA to put on their creative thinking cap and try to imagine different ways that listeria could be transferred and being, spread throughout a facility in the event of a positive, or where there are positive findings. And that's exactly what we see FDA doing as well. So the new sort of, the new challenge we see in industry is the agencies, although recalls are voluntary, will be pushing and urging very hard food companies to broaden the scope to include products that were never in the past included in these recalls. And frankly, they're coming at tremendous expense to industry. So that's number one. That's big. And it'll be important if we do find ourselves in a scenario where we're finding listeria in our facility, or we're concerned, that we make sure we've got support to be able to answer those questions from the agency if they do in fact come. The other trend we're seeing, which is also equally disturbing, is FDA and USDA announcing their expectations to food companies that are struggling with perhaps a contamination issue. We found listeria perhaps in a product that was collected at retail or in the market, and the agents, and now there's a recall. And after the scope is defined, in most cases by the agency, sort of trying to drive it down the throat of the company with few options, is the expectation that the company at least shut down certain processing areas or its facility altogether until the root source or root cause analysis is completed and its corrective actions are put in place to the satisfaction of the agency. That's not, that's something we saw in cases in the past that involved large-scale, foodborne illness outbreaks and human illness or worse, but we're now seeing it sort of in the more routine cases. So we may find ourselves, if we have to announce a recall, responding to agencies' expectations that the facility is closed or production is halted, at least for a period of time until certain are resolved. That's another big trend we saw starting just in the last 12 months, with the agencies being extremely forceful with respect to the companies that they're regulating. And the third is, unfortunately, as a lawyer, I don't like lawyers either, at least not most of them. There's a few good ones out there. But, now suddenly we're seeing class action lawsuits being served against and filed against food companies for announcing voluntary recalls. Brand new in 2024. This has never happened before. I've been practicing for more than 25 years, never saw it happen, and it's happening now. And these plaintiff law firms are saying, hey, we can use the same theories we're using against food companies. If they made a claim on their label, they said it was all natural. If it wasn't, they were purporting that the product was something that it wasn't, under the theory that consumers were misled because they believed the product was, all natural when it wasn't, or it was low calorie or healthy when it wasn't. Well, those same theories are now being brought and asserted against food companies who recall their products, with the plaintiff lawyers saying, hey, if our clients knew, if the consuming public knew that your ready-to-eat product had listeria, they would have paid less for it. And now they get all their money back. And they're seeking penalties and fines and recovery of all sorts of different damages. And this is disturbing because now, and there's a lot of public policy arguments that we have and can use in defense of these types of claims. And I'm hopeful that eventually they will all prove to be unsuccessful. But this is the new reality. When we're in the boardroom thinking about whether it makes sense, whether we have to recall a particular product, in addition to thinking about, okay, what is the scope? Is the agencies going to require us to shut our doors for a period of time? Now we also have to think about not only cost, but are we going to be slammed or slapped with a class action lawsuit from lawyers purporting to represent every consumer who purchased our product that was available that had been recalled? So again, these new dynamics are working their way into recall management and recall strategic decisions. And frankly, it's things are changing faster than I've ever seen in my career, which is why I liken this to a haunted house, incredibly high adrenaline theme park, and a funny house, I guess. We saw recently class action lawsuits being brought against Boar's Head on behalf of consumers who were allegedly misled with respect to the quality or safety of the product. We saw class action lawsuits asserted against Bruce Pack. I think the first was settled, at least that's what I heard. I don't know if there's any litigation that continues to be pending. The second is being defended aggressively. And then more recently, we also had a client, Milos. Milo is a Amish egg farmer, egg producer. He's got a farm. He makes eggs, sells them in a relatively small geographic market. They're great eggs, but Milo announced a recall a number of months ago voluntarily because there were some salmonella issues alleged, or the eggs were alleged to have contained salmonella. And this poultry farmer in northern Wisconsin was sued by a class action lawsuit lawyer and from South Carolina purporting to represent a national class of plaintiffs seeking to recover expansive damages and losses from this relatively small farmer. And actually, Milo doesn't even have a cell phone, and we communicate via fax. This case is a motion to dismiss. We put together, we filed. We're hopeful that the court will realize that this is an absurd case, never should have been brought, and it will be dismissed promptly and outright. That's our hope. But I show this and I share it because nobody is immune, no matter how large your company is or how small your company is. The plaintiff lawyers are now poised to pounce on any company that announces a voluntary recall and seek damages in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars because of your decision to voluntarily recall a product that didn't quite satisfy perhaps the expectations of consumers or the regulators. So if you are faced with a recall, or if you're planning a mock recall, the possibility of class action lawsuits and the cost of defense and the potential liability should also be part of the conversation, because this is just adding, potentially millions of additional dollars on top of the millions of dollars that are frequently spent just announcing and executing a recall itself. There is, of course, criminal liability continues to become, we see, more and more visibility with respect to the prospect of criminal liability when companies, when their food products are associated with foodborne illness outbreaks and people get sick. Those trends are not reversing. We expect in any case now where there is an outbreak and a product is associated with illness and that product is recalled or identified, that there may be, at least there'll be some level of DOJ interest. This is paraphrasing, but to prove, to get a criminal conviction against a company or a food company executive after an outbreak or people get sick from as a result of a food, DOJ really only has to prove the following three elements, which is, number one, the defendant was aware of a condition that could lead to consumers getting sick or product becoming contaminated. Not product becoming contaminated, but a condition that could lead to that. Let's say intermittent listeria findings in a food processing facility that produces ready-to-eat foods. The defendant is in a position to eliminate the condition, get rid of the listeria, stop production for a week, tear down the line, do an aggressive cleaning, sanitation, reassemble the line, retest, got negatives, and now you can resume production a week later. We all know that doesn't happen, but that's sort of the expectation in this new world in which we live. And then number three, the defendant fails to eliminate the condition. We're in a position to get rid of the listeria, but we fail to do so, usually evidenced by people getting sick in the community. An outbreak occurs, and for each count, we could see, depending on the severity of the illness, up to a year in prison or a $250,000 fine. That's per ice cream cone. So the teeth here are pretty sharp and pretty significant. So this also should be part of the conversation in the event, we're ever asking ourselves in the boardroom, boy, do we think our products are making people sick based on what we're hearing from the regulators, and what action should we take in response? That rolls us into traceability. It's super important now as we're moving forward, especially with the new traceability rules, FDA, on the FDA side, Part 204. USDA is easy, one forward, one back. And we've got the systems in place to be able to track those types of products and have really robust traceability when it comes to meat and poultry products. On the FDA side, of course, we have the new rules. They go into effect about a year from now in 2026, requiring that certain foods on the food traceability list have additional records so that FDA is better positioned to trace offending food product through the supply chain or up the supply chain back to consumers. And of course, industry right now, we see them struggling with, boy, if I'm a processor, how do I comply and make sure all my customers are getting the information they need? If I'm a retailer, how do I ensure my suppliers are providing me the information that I need? I guess the point I would say here is, we should be talking at this point, processors and manufacturers with their customers and vice versa, making sure that our systems are aligned so that we're able to share the information that's required and then also receive it in such a way that we're going to be able to establish compliance with the regulators. Super important. We've been working with a lot of companies in the industry, helping them sort of get in the right place as it relates to traceability and the new rules. I put an X here at 2022. It seems like it was yesterday, but already, we passed 2023, a year went by. We've now blown past 2024. Another year went by, and before you know it, we're going to be at the end of this year, and compliance is right around the corner. What I will say, as far as traceability is concerned, FDA has made it known that although the compliance date is January 20th, 2026, for those of you who fall within the scope and purview of the rule, the agency does not intend to enforce the provisions of the new traceability rule until 2027, which will give industry some additional time to make sure that their systems are in place. I'd say at this point, invest as many resources as you can to get the systems built so they're ready by January 2026, and then use the next 3, 4, 5, 6 months to work out the kinks. So by the time FDA begins enforcement in 2027, you are ready. Just a quick follow-up on echoing Bob's comments on mock recalls. We like to call it rocking the mock. We do, you may have heard or seen them, mock trials, criminal trials, park doctrine, criminal trials or civil trials for food industry clients and organizations. And they're very valuable. I think, doing a mock recall is extremely valuable as well for all the reasons that Bob talked about. I think as well, you can, when he talked about layering in uncertainty and surprises, it's important to layer in those real world scenarios. Get everybody together, including the leadership, and say, listen, over the next 2 hours, we're going to talk about what would typically happen over the course of a week. On Monday, we get a call because some product was collected at retail by the state of Florida and they tested it and it was positive for listeria. Well, what do we do in response to that? Have the group really dig into what did the agency do? How was the product collected? What was the methodology? Or do we have consumer complaints? What about internal issues? What if we had a system failure? What if we had a bad supplier? What about issues maybe we inherited from upstream? If so, how do we define that on the fly with imperfect information? How will we contain it? What is the scope? Are we going to have a debate about whether we recall everything made on lines 1, 2, 3, or 4, or can we limit it to 3? And then how are we going to respond to the agency when they want to expand it? And is it appropriate to recall in this circumstance? And oh, by the way, if we do, we're going to be slapped with a class action lawsuit in 2 weeks. Who's going to be, how are we going to respond to that? Recall communications. Who's our PR person? How are we going to, communicate to the public if perhaps what we're being told is not only you have a positive, but we think there may be, 16 cases with 4 of them reporting exposure to your product and there's now a death. How are we going to respond if there's questions from the media, And then, of course, who pays for what? Do we have insurance? Is it insured? These are all the things that can be added on to those mock recall scenarios to make it as real as possible so that when that real day does, in fact, come, everybody will have been tested to the point, they will have sweated, they will have, wished this wasn't, something they ever signed up for, but when the real day occurs, you will have trained as you fight, so you can fight as you have trained, and the process will be a success. So in ending, anytime we're faced with a difficult decision regarding product recalls or what to do with respect to food safety, always ask yourself, what would 12 jurors think? You'll always get to the right answer. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for those great presentations, Bob and Sean. And before we have your presenters address our questions, I'd like to remind you that we love your feedback. So please take a few moments to complete our webinar survey, which you'll see on your screen. And let's see, we've got a lot of great questions from people coming in. I'd like to start with a question for Bob, because I think this is a really interesting one. Does a mock recall exercise require the movement and or handling of actual product?
The mock recalls that I've been involved in, they didn't really handle actual product, but what you do is you trace it to identify exactly where it's at. And the further out that you can go, the better off you'll be. I mean, obviously, everything within your facility, you should be able to actually identify. In those cases, I would walk out to see, is that product there? But obviously beyond that, it's going to be very difficult to get a hold of it because it's in transit or it could be in a multitude of different areas. But it's a great question. The stuff that's within your control, I would actually walk out and see, is it there? You may identify that stuff that you thought was in one location is actually in another location? So that's actually a really good question. So thank you for that.
Great. Thank you, Bob. All right. Sean, I'm going to throw out a question for you. Does conducting a mock recall have any effect on liability for a company?
It doesn't. Not the exercise of doing it directly, but I would say that those companies who embrace the mock recall process, who actually roll up their sleeves and decide to do it and go through, the process that everybody's heard about today, will be much better positioned to make the right decisions really on a dime and to pivot quickly in such a way that will significantly limit their exposure in the event of a real recall. Sometimes we see companies that are faced with what ends up becoming an extremely large recall. They're very surprised by it, and they haven't gone through the process or been tested before to really think through, what's most important, what are the questions we should be asking, how do we do this assessment, and sometimes they make the wrong decisions. And what seems like a simple decision on the front end can relate to, or can ultimately translate to, millions of additional dollars of exposure down the line if it's incorrect. So yes, the process itself, I think, can help companies limit exposure by having that experience.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean. We're going to take a couple extra minutes here to answer some more of your questions, since we had two such great presentations and so many great questions coming in. So we'll stay with us if you want to participate in the Q&A for a little bit longer. Okay, Bob, I'm going to throw out another question for you. Sure. All right. Let's see. So so you talked about having those corporate and facility teams for your mock recall and assembling those. What is the role of the consumer affairs team or department in a mock recall?
Well, I mean, it depends on exactly what they're doing. If your consumer affairs team is collecting information, a lot of times, with regard to consumer complaints, they can be definitely one of the most important groups that, a lot of companies will say, if we see three complaints in a row from the same lot, then we're going to activate the system. So these are people that you absolutely want to stay very close to, whether you're on the quality side or the operations teams. It should be a direct line, right? So as they're starting to get consumer complaints in, to be bringing that information to the appropriate people at the facilities. I've seen where, you get one complaint, then a second one comes in, and it's like, okay, well, maybe that's a coincidence. Then you see 10 come in. And so understanding exactly, because they're seeing the trends on a daily basis. So I would have very close ties to them and absolutely have them on your teams, because not only from the initiation of a mock recall or a real recall, information is going to continue to come in to provide you with information. Now you're going to have to react to that information. So I would very tightly align with those teams.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Bob. All right, Sean, I'm going to throw out another question for you. So regarding traceability and meeting those requirements in January 2026, who in a food organization typically owns, legally speaking, the responsibility for ensuring that the company is going to meet the traceability rules?
Well, at the end of the day, it would be the company leadership. From just a technical standpoint, and if let's say, but from a practical standpoint, it would be the vice president or director of regulation or food safety and quality. If we had a scenario, and I hope we never do, but if we had a scenario where a company was required to follow the new traceability rules. For whatever reason, bad culture, the leadership didn't commit the resources or, assign the appropriate people. So the traceability requirements were never met. And there's a large outbreak that makes a lot of people sick, maybe even kills a few consumers. And FDA comes in and says, okay, we're trying to solve this outbreak. Where's your information? And they don't have it. And as a result of that, the finding the source of the outbreak and stopping it is delayed. and more people get sick and maybe there's more deaths, DOJ would say, well, in that case, the CEO or corporate leadership, maybe we're looking at bringing charges against them as individuals because ultimately, it was on their watch, and perhaps even, the head of food safety in that organization, because nothing was done. So, everybody's responsible technically, the buck stops at the top, but, what we see practically is usually the head of food safety are the folks who are responsible.
Okay, thanks for that, Sean. All right, we have time for one more question today. I'm going to throw this out to Bob. Are there any available documentation that can be provided to raw materials suppliers for their traceability exercises to ensure that they maintain compliance? Or maybe, Sean, you have a pulse on that too.
Yeah, I mean, Sean can talk to the documentations if he wishes to. The one thing that I would say, and we're seeing it, and really Sean touched on it with his talk, but it's really focusing on the relationship with your suppliers. And we're seeing this with regard to this past year. We saw a lot of suppliers involved in some very large recalls. So one of the things that I've talked about either online or with others is making sure that you're having these solid partnerships and relationships with your suppliers and talk through what some of your challenges are. I mean, obviously, it's hard to go to all of your suppliers, so you're going to want to focus it by priority and level of risk. But you want to have those discussions and maybe, whatever challenges or concerns that you have, start adding those too and start building a list with them. Then maybe that becomes your benchmark for all of your other suppliers. They may have something as well that they use because they're working with additional ingredient suppliers on their end. So it's something that you can build, and really it comes down to the level of risk and exactly what you want for information.
Yeah, I'll just tie things up. There's two categories really. There's the supplier and there's the retailer, whether it's restaurant chain or grocery chain. From the retailer standpoint, we're hearing two things. On the one hand, our suppliers are coming at us and there's, 13 or 23 different ways of communicating the information, and we're trying to figure out how we can accommodate that versus, hey, we're going to create the standard and tell our suppliers what they have to meet, and it's going to be uniform across the board. I think, to echo Bob's point, it really does. Success requires communication. I've seen retailers sending out correspondence to their suppliers saying, listen, here are our high-level expectations, what we are going to require from you moving forward, and that gives suppliers the opportunity to either tweak their systems to make sure they can satisfy those, or to raise their hand and reach out and say, listen, we can't do that, but what's a good alternative, right? When we have that dialogue, I think everybody eventually will get to the right spot. But if we're operating in our own little silos, never going to happen. So pick up the phone, send emails, even have meetings, get together and really encourage that conversation so everybody's on the same page.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Bob, for that excellent Q&A. So this is a great discussion today, and unfortunately, it's all the time we have for questions. Thanks for joining us a little bit after the hour. But please join me in once again thanking Bob and Sean for their presentations. So if you have any additional questions or comments, you can click that email us button on the console, and we'll go ahead and share those with our presenters so that they can respond directly to you. And if you didn't have a chance to fill it out earlier, you'll be redirected shortly to the post-event survey, and we do always look forward to hearing how we can make our programs work better for you. Also, please make sure to visit food-safety.com/webinars for the archive of this presentation. You can share that with your colleagues on demand, as well as information about our other upcoming events. You can save the date, too, for our annual Food Safety Summit taking place from May 12th through the 15th in Rosemont, Illinois. The Food Safety Summit gives you the opportunity to connect with peers, learn from, and network with leading subject matter experts, and so much more. Registration for the summit is open, so please click the Food Safety Summit logo on the bottom right of the console for more information and to register. So we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, and we hope you found it to be a valuable experience. Have a great rest of your day.